Thank you, Paul, for having me, and thank you for the Friends of the Library for making this happen. I am a big fan of this library. I am married to a Livermore citizen who worked at the former location of this library across the way as a teenager. And when we come here to Livermore, we usually have 3 stops: Wendy, Panama Reds, and this library. We come here to hang out and to read and to just take it all in. It's a real gift to this community, and it reminds me a lot of the Ann Arbor Public Library, where I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I give the Ann Arbor Public Library much of the credit for why I became a lover of books and decided that I wanted to try and make one myself someday. So this book, Brat Pack America, A Love Letter to 80s Teen Movies, is my 3rd. Paul has an old copy of my bio, which does not include my 2nd, which I came here for. And that book was called Practical Classics. I took on the mission of rereading everything I was assigned in high school as a 40-year-old. So that was a lot of fun to do also. In this case, I ended up rewatching all of the movies that I was familiar with in high school for the purposes of doing this book. This particular book, Brat Pack America, A Love Letter to 80s Teen Movies, the subject is pretty self-explanatory. The now legendary teen movies of the 1980s, and I'm assuming when I said that, you in the audience had one of 3 responses. Response number 1, hooray! Those are the movies of my childhood. I can't wait to hear about Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Dirty Dancing. 2, exactly what do you mean when you say 80s teen movie? Please explain. Or 3, listen, buddy. I have a certain set of high expectations for what goes on here at the Livermore Public Library on a Saturday afternoon, and I don't really care what you're talking about. Make it interesting, make it entertaining, and hurry the hell up. I have put together a few remarks for each of these 3 groups that I think will take the following shape. What is an 80s teen movie? Where do they come from? Where do they go? And why do they matter? And at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions, and we will also talk about your favorite 80s teen movies, and I'll tell you some things you might not know about them. In fact, I'm pretty sure you won't know about them. That's something, I've been on tour for 1.5 years for this book, and that's one of the favorites that audiences all over the country have liked. You name a movie from this period, and I will tell you something you don't know about it. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Fantastic. All right, let's start at the beginning then. What is an 80s teen movie? Practically speaking, we are usually talking, when we talk about 80s teen movies, about movies written and or directed by a man named John Hughes. You are probably familiar with many of those. The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, Pretty in Pink, and Some Kind of Wonderful. We may also be talking about ginormous hit movies like Back to the Future, or Dirty Dancing, or Footloose, all of which made an ungodly amount of money at the box office. We may be talking about kid favorites like the Goonies or the Karate Kid. We may be talking about Academy Award winners like Breaking Away or Dead Poets Society, or cult movies that from that time that have since become legend like Over the Edge or Wild Style or Heathers. To simplify, we are talking about movies released in theaters roughly in the decade of the 1980s, where the main character was a person in high school, and the movie's themes were somehow related to that character's adolescence. Most importantly, we are speaking of movies told from the point of view of a teenager, where the characters are not symbols, not representations, not vehicles for adult nostalgia, but real people. 80s teen movies are remembered for these things and a few other key factors. 1, immensely quotable dialogue. A number of very gifted writers and directors brought the most famous of these movies to life. There's a reason we are still saying Goonies never say die, or fair is fair, or Great Scott, or Neo Maxi Zoom Dweeby. Many of the lines that come from this movie that still make us laugh testify as to how fresh and original they still sound to this day. Number 2, the careers that were minted by this movie. It would be hard to discuss this period in American movie history without mentioning that it is when we first saw Matthew Broderick and Sarah Jessica Parker, or Broadway greats like Jennifer Jason Leigh and Martha Plimpton, as well as future Academy Award winners like Sean Penn and Nicolas Cage and Forrest Whitaker. Behind the camera, directors like Amy Heckerling and Cameron Crowe, and future president of the Directors Guild of America, Martha Coolidge, come out of this period as well. Number 3, of course, we were just hearing it a moment ago, soundtracks. The 1980s in this country were the time of the consolidation of commercial radio and the beginning of national record store chains like Sam Goody and Musicland. And it was also the time of the birth of MTV. This is the first time in modern film history that movies become hits at the box office because of hit soundtracks. And that is a reality of movie making that continues to this very day. So though there are great teen movies made every year, and we will talk about those at Q&A, because I'm sure you're curious, most walk on the road laid down by these movies from the 1980s. Movies like 8th Grade and Dear Simon, which came out very recently, TV shows like Stranger Things, and books like Twilight and The Hunger Games are the children and grandchildren of these movies. Every year, the Library of Congress declares a new list of movies to include in its National Film Registry. That is cinema to be preserved for all time under mandate of the Library of Congress because of its cultural, historical, and aesthetic significance to the American experience. 8 teen movies from the 1980s are on that registry. In the eyes of the Library of Congress, that means that Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, The Breakfast Club, La Bamba, Stand and Deliver, and The Goonies, to name only a few, are as important to America's cultural heritage as Gone with the Wind, or The Wizard of Oz, or Citizen Kane. No other decade has even half that many teen movies on the list. Now, the more I went looking, the more I found. In this book, there are 55 teen movies, some which you will expect and some which you will most likely not, many of whom you have heard of, and quite a few you will be adding to your Netflix queue or your queue right here on the web page of the Livermore Public Library when you get home. And when it comes time for Q&A, like I said, we will. You may ask me about any of the movies in this book, and I will tell you something not in this book that you probably don't know about that movie. So that is a brief overview of what is an 80s teen movie. Now let's talk about where and why. Where does the 80s teen movie come from, and why this particular moment in American movie history? So, teen movies have been around as long as popular culture has had an idea of what a teenager is. Therefore, the earliest teen movies are usually considered the product of the 1950s. Movies like Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause. The movies from that period saw teenagers as a social problem that needed fixing, like potholes, or drug addiction, or poor performance in school. In fact, the name Rebel Without a Cause was taken from a psychology textbook that was a series of case studies about psychopathic behavior in young people. If we go forward a decade to the 1960s, we are talking about teen movies like Riot on the Sunset Strip, and Medium Cool, and Two for the Road, and we are talking about movies where teenagers are largely symbols of that particular period in history, symbols of an angry and lost generation. The next decade, in the 1970s, we have movies like Summer of '42 and American Graffiti. Those are movies that are specifically made for adults about teenagers. American Graffiti was released in 1973, but was about 1961. The intended audience were people who were teenagers in 1961, who are now grown-ups, probably with jobs and mortgages and children of their own, who were thinking about that time in their lives. All of these movies are about teenagers told from an adult point of view. It would take until the 1980s for movies to be told about teenagers from a teenager's point of view, where the teenager was the main actor in their own story, in their own life. So what changed? Well, the very first thing that happened were two little movies from the 1970s, one about a shark and one about a thing called The Force. Can anybody tell me what those movies were?
Jaws and Star Wars.
Jaws and Star Wars. Jaws and Star Wars succeeded in single-handedly dragging the median age of the American moviegoer downward. They were the biggest blockbusters ever until at that moment. They were the two movies that invented what we now refer to as the summer blockbuster. And by 1980, largely thanks to Jaws and Star Wars, 86% of ticket-buying audiences in this country were under the age of 30. At the same time, the 1980s had more teenagers in the workplace than any decade since World War II. They actually the Department of Labor started keeping those statistics immediately following World War II. And pretty soon, 4 decades later, in the 1980s, you have more teenagers with jobs than at any time in American history. So you have a lot of teenagers walking around with money in their pockets that did not have them before. We also had the place where a lot of these teenagers had jobs, which were shopping malls. The 80s is the high water mark of the shopping mall in this country. And what do shopping malls have? Shopping malls have movie theaters. They have movie theaters, they have teenagers with pocket change, and they have movies that are suddenly of interest to young people. These things collide to create an environment where movies about teenagers suddenly have a ready, willing audience to buy tickets. So, there is no accepted wisdom on what is the first 80s teen movie. When you write a book on them, you have to declare some boundaries, or you will never finish that book. You have to say, this is what I'm talking about, and this is not what I'm talking about. Or else you will spend 10 years researching, and you will never reach the end of the rainbow. So, for my purposes, I decided the very first teen movie was a movie that came out in 1979 called Breaking Away, which, I don't know how many of you have seen, is a movie that won an Academy Award for Best Screenplay, is in fact in the Library of Congress's National Film Registry, and is about 4 recent high school graduates in Bloomington, Indiana, who are all deciding what to do with their lives. It was essentially the film debut of Dennis Quaid and Daniel Stern. The screenplay, as I said, won an Academy Award. And at the center of the movie is a bike race that is held every year at the University of Indiana called, what is it called? It's called the Little 500, that's right. And it is always in April, right before finals at the University of Indiana. Breaking Away features the Little Five, which has been run continuously at the University of Indiana since. In fact, President Obama stopped during his campaign stop in Bloomington to speak at the Little Five. And the Little Five is now televised on cable TV because the billionaire Mark Cuban, who owns a bunch of cable TV stations, is a University of Indiana alumnus. And so he now broadcasts the Little Five on his cable. It was featured in this movie, Breaking Away, which to my mind is the very first 80s teen movie. Some people will say Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Some people will say 16 Candles. Those all came a little bit later. At the end of this decade, released in March of 1989, we have a little-known movie called Heathers. And people are surprised to find out that Heathers was a complete bomb in its day. Nobody went to see Heathers. In fact, the company that released it had gone bankrupt the month before the movie came out, and they had one newspaper ad in the Los Angeles Times that the producer had to pay for out of her own pocket. So Heathers did not succeed at all. It was largely known as a cult movie that was successful on home video and cable TV and in midnight movies on college campuses after that. Heathers has endured for so long that it has recently become a Broadway musical that you can buy tickets to and see on stage. It launched the careers of Winona Ryder and of Christian Slater. The screenwriter of Heathers, who I spoke to for this book, Daniel Waters, went on to write many big budget movies like Demolition Man and The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. And Heathers is a movie that satirizes the 80s teen movie. I decided that was the end of our story because when a movie has enough of its own cliches when a movie genre has enough of its own cliches that you can create a satire of it, its day in the sun has probably passed. So, Breaking Away over here Heather's over here in 1989, and 55 and 53 other movies in between, at least for the purposes of this one. So what happens after 1989, when Heather's comes out? Well, for a very short period of time, movies about young people in this country were more concerned with those mysterious post-college years, that early career period of life. The early to mid-90s were the time of movies like Slacker, and Singles, and Before Sunrise, and Reality Bites. Those are all movies about being recently graduated from college, out in the adult world, and feeling lost. And then in July of 1995, a little movie called Clueless came out. Clueless reinvigorated our interest in the teen movie and brought its prominence back to American moviegoing, and there it has remained ever since. Each year, great movies come out about teenagers. Just within the last few years, we've had movies like 8th Grade and Dear Simon, Edge of 17, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, Dope. These are all fantastic movies. So there are still movies being made about teenagers now. The difference between then and now is most of those movies I've just described are the kinds of movies you will see at a smaller theater with wizened people in their 30s and 40s driving Volvos and Priuses with NPR bumper stickers. Some of them are considered movies for teenagers, but they are not considered blockbuster summer entertainment the way a movie like I shouldn't say Dirty Dancing. Nobody thought Dirty Dancing was going to be a success, and that turned out to be an enormous success. The teen movie has become a sort of subcategory of indie film in a way. It is not considered, unless you are talking about a movie like The Hunger Games or Twilight, it's not considered a giant mainstream category. Which is, we can say is a shame, or we can say thank God there's still great teen movies. Now, you would be a reasonable person to ask that unless you are a film scholar or a very nostalgic person, why would you, or lost here on a Saturday afternoon at the Livermore Public Library, why would you be interested in this subject? That is a totally fair question. I asked myself that question many times in the 2 years that I spent writing Brat Pack America. And in the year and a half I spent on tour speaking about it, the compliment I got most often was, I read your book and it brought back such great memories of all of these movies. And I think that is pretty cool. You know, I feel honored that I wrote this book that ended up making people feel good about a time in life that both people have terrible feelings and terrible memories of. I think that is an accomplishment I take very seriously and an honor I hold very dear. But fundamentally, what I was trying to do here in this book was run the opposite direction from nostalgia. And what I mean by that is not that we should feel bad for liking things from long ago, but that nostalgia fundamentally is missing a thing that is gone and will never come back. And if 80s teen movies were simply archaeological relics from a lost civilization before cell phones and laptops and that sort of thing, well, we would miss them, but we wouldn't remake them, and we wouldn't show them to our kids and our grandkids, and we wouldn't have a generation of movies that followed in their example. And the 80s wouldn't have been a decade celebrated and memorialized for more years than it actually existed, which is the weirdest thing of all. I mean, we are 30 years in, and Steven Spielberg is still willing to spend his valuable time making Ready Player One, which is a giant wet kiss to the pop culture of the 1980s. Are there any other decades in American history you can say that about? Not many, which is the strangest thing of all. These movies would not be preserved in the Library of Congress, sitting there in Washington, D.C. for all time, if they were not significant somehow. If I took anything away from writing Brat Pack America, it is that we forget and throw away our culture too fast, and we do so to our own detriment. We declare movies and books and music and television shows old and therefore irrelevant and therefore not worth our attention before we've even stopped to ask, are they worth remembering or not? We think new equals better, as if culture is the same thing as milk. We think that because of the sheer volume of great movies and books and music and television shows that is available to us now, we think that the mandate those things are giving us to keep up gets louder and louder, and somehow we have to run faster and faster to do that. And somehow, because it's louder, it's therefore that much more worth listening to. And at the same time, every one of us who is not 21 anymore in this room reaches a certain age, and we feel a very strong urge to remain stuck in the past, thinking that the music and movies and books and TV of the present simply isn't for us anymore, that we are out of touch, and therefore we don't belong, and that we ourselves are irrelevant. Let me just say, the very building we're sitting in makes everything I've just said untrue. Imagine what a library would be if it arbitrarily only focused on what was new. Or if it picked a random time in cultural history and said, this is the only time that matters, and forget about what happened came before or after. It's old. It's irrelevant. Libraries are beautiful things because of their faith in discovery and in knowledge, and in their faith is as an ever-expanding as opposed to contracting horizon. Expanding forever, quite frankly. I think there's a good lesson in there for all of us. You know, that's why I wrote this book, as a way of paying tribute to a very specific moment in movie history, but one that 30 years in the past continues to be with us today. And it also continues to remind us that moments like this one are minted every single day. And it's our job to listen for them. Thank you. All right. Enough from me. Let's do the fun part. So, you may ask a question about this book. You may ask a question about writing. You may ask a question about the 80s or the 80s teen movies. If you have no particular question in mind and you just want to know something about your favorite 80s teen movie, you just shout out the name and we'll go from that.
What's your favorite 80s teen movie?
Oh, I've never been asked that question. Unlike a good old meat and potatoes Sunday afternoon kind of day, Back to the Future, every single time. I was really lucky. I got to see Back to the Future for its 30th anniversary screening at Radio City Music Hall. I happened to be in New York when that was happening. And this is the best part. The 30th anniversary screening of Back to the Future came out on July 2nd. I was not there on July 2nd. I was there at the end of October, because the anniversary screening is on the 26th of October, i.e. the day that Marty McFly went back in time. Marty McFly went back in time October 26th, 1985, and that's when they had the 30th anniversary screening. And they had a live orchestra, conducted by Alan Silvestri, who composed the score for Back to the Future. And this is the best part, I was there with my dad. Is Back to the Future not the perfect movie to see sitting next to your dad? So that was a really lucky experience. Otherwise, Over the Edge, Heathers, Legend of Billie Jean. I love them all for one reason or another. Back to the Future is kind of my meat and potatoes choice. Yes, sir.
I want to ask you something in the things you've said. Pushing 80.
Could have fooled me.
Yeah, but, I like